Thanks so much for being here. We're going to let folks join the session for just a couple seconds, a minute longer, to make sure we get everyone in the room, and then we'll get started. It's great to see some familiar faces in the room. So if you want to go ahead and get us started by throwing your name and what organization you're joining from, and maybe where in the city you live, or where in the state you're joining in, calling in. We'd love to kind of see who's represented. Looks like we've got some great Central Virginia, Northern Virginia representation.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. I will go ahead and get started by introducing our speaker for today. So for those of you I haven't met, it's great to kind of virtually meet you. My name is Annalise Gamble, and I work here for Serve Virginia. I'm really excited to be partnering with SIR out of Richmond on this exciting new project, and partnering with SIR, but partnering with all of you as well. And so I'm really excited to introduce Andy Bates, who is a principal with SIR. SIR is a research firm out of Richmond, Virginia that works on a wide variety of projects. And Andy himself brings a really diverse background of local news reporting, creative writing, and now has an expertise in community engagement data. So we're really excited to dig into the results with you today, and be able to hear a little bit from you as to what the data tells you and what you see trend-wise. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Andy to get us started. Thanks for being here, Andy.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Annalise. I'm going to pull my screen up and just reiterate how excited I am to finally get a chance to share some of this data that I've been digging into over the past few weeks here. And it's a really exciting opportunity to share some of these insights from the Virginia Community Engagement Index that Kathy teased in her opening remarks. But before we dive in, just want to quickly orient ourselves in the conversation we'll have today, take a look at what we'll be covering. So first, want to give ourselves a little bit of context and background around the project itself, some of the principles we used to guide the process, as well as the goals and methodology we used in implementing the study. Also want to give you a quick look at who took the survey by going through some of the respondent profile and demographic factors that we have. But really the focus on today is about taking some of those top line findings that Kathy mentioned and really taking them a step further to see how we as an ecosystem and how you as individuals within your organizations can start to use some of this data to mobilize more Virginians. And so to do that, we'll really dig into some of the community priorities that they ranked, how they're engaging in their communities through informal volunteerism, formal volunteerism, civic action. Also want to use the role of trust to kind of color and get at some of the why behind the community engagement actions that they're taking, and then really use all of those things to talk about how we can extend the invitation to more people to serve and contribute in their communities, really around how do we invite them, who do we target, and then how do we measure our success at mobilizing them. So yeah, again, we'll start with the guiding principles and goals. And as Kathy mentioned in her opening remarks, I did just want to orient this within the context of their 3-year state service plan. What's really a key takeaway when it comes to the Virginia Community Engagement Index and why this was such a important project to undertake is that while she had mentioned how these insights are going to be used to help recruitment and messaging, the data and insights gained from this are really a way for the ecosystem and for Serve Virginia to advance all 3 of these strategies at once. She already mentioned some of the resources that will be available to partners through the campaign and the partner toolkits. And really the amount of outreach and input we received from folks within the sector was really a great step toward building that more representative, integrated, and aligned network of partners, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But before we dig into those findings a little bit deeper, I did want to kind of orient ourselves in the national landscape. The national narrative is pretty consistent. All it takes is a quick Google search to tell you that volunteerism is down. Gallup, US Census data, trade level studies, they all point to this trend. But from our perspective, when we were starting out, this was a narrative that has traditionally been told from a deficit-based perspective, which folks in the sector and the stakeholders in this room already know. So when we started off in this process, we really wanted to take a look at how could we approach this from more of a strengths-based perspective? How could we shine a brighter light on really what's happening related to community engagement in Virginia, so that we can better understand our strengths and then use those strengths to overcome some of these deficits and declines that are affecting organizations across the Commonwealth and across the nation. So to start, like I said, we built a coalition and really assessed the landscape. As Kathy had mentioned in her opening, we assembled a core team of representatives from 39 organizations throughout Virginia. And you see just some of the bucket areas or sectors from which these core team members came. But we really wanted to get at what do we truly want to accomplish with this study? What are the specific data and insights that will be most beneficial to members from each of these sectors? And are there any national models and partners that we can leverage? So when we started to do that and assess that landscape, we did find out there the National Conference on Citizenship's Civic Health Index, which some of you might be familiar with. And we really liked this tool because it was a widely used tool that over 30 states in the country have used. And it looks at a variety of civic participation indicators, primarily leveraging that data from the Community Engagement and Volunteering supplement from the US Census. But the more we talked to our core members, the more we found that the ecosystem in Virginia really wanted something that was more unique to Virginia, more encompassing of Virginia, that really broadened our understanding of all the avenues of community engagement, from formal service and volunteering to those neighborly acts that we do every day, and also civic and democratic action. Most priority, and Kathy mentioned this as well, was that our stakeholders really wanted this to point to community priorities, so that we could be sure that we're channeling resources and volunteers, not just for the sake of it, but to really make a difference against what people feel are the most pressing needs facing our communities. And then finally, we wanted this study to drive messaging and strategies for recruitment and retention that we could then measure over time. So when it came to building out this study, the questions that we would ask, we really leveraged the insights from that core team to pinpoint what would be most actionable for them. And we also leveraged some national partners for thought leadership from AmeriCorps, Points of Light. We also talked with NCOC about their approach. And so we really wanted to bring that local perspective, that Commonwealth-centric perspective, while also keeping in mind that there are national trends out there and national studies that we want to be able to speak to as well. Once we had that survey developed, we distributed it and fielded it from January 30th through March 8th of this year. And as Kathy mentioned, in total, we received almost 6,400 responses. Did want to talk a little bit about how we procured those responses and what it means. And so about a little over 3,000 we purchased through our research panel providers, Qualtrics and Cint. And then we also asked those core team members to distribute links to the survey through their communications channels, on their newsletters, their websites. And with that total rate of participation of nearly 6,400 residents in Virginia, that really allowed us to weight the data to more accurately reflect Virginia's diversity, both geographically and demographically. One other piece of level setting and a lens that I want to put on the findings that we're going to dive into is what makes this sample unique. Again, we wanted to look at really focusing on what the state of community engagement is in Virginia, as well as volunteerism and service. And so when we think about who took the survey, it's important to keep a few caveats in mind. One, the people who took the survey through our panel providers, they're potentially more apt to be engaged because they've agreed to be part of a research panel. And obviously the folks that we were able to get through our core team, they're significantly more likely to be engaged because they're already in the ecosystem. And so when we think about the total survey universe here, we should really be thinking about these responses and these data points as engaged Virginians, or more likely to engage Virginians, not necessarily indicative of everyday Virginians or the general public. And so what that consideration then does from a data perspective is you'll see here that our volunteer engagement numbers will likely be higher than what is being reported nationally. Again, this was an intentional choice because we really wanted to get a full understanding of community engagement in Virginia and the strengths in the ecosystem. But because we have such a highly engaged survey universe, it really allows us to dig deeper into the motivations that Virginians feel, the benefits they receive from volunteering and service, any barriers. We can dive a little bit deeper into Virginia-specific barriers, perhaps, that can help us understand why volunteerism may be declining. And then again, we can really start to dig into ways that people are engaging in Virginia that don't necessarily fit into those traditional volunteerism buckets. So with that caveat out of the way, let's take a quick look at who of these folks are. Again, we had a sample of almost 6,400, and that size of a sample allows us to weight the data to be representative of Virginia. And so what you see here is that we are relatively in line with the state when it comes to gender, generation, and region. The inner circle of these charts represents the Virginia or our sample proportions, and the outer chart represents Virginia. And just from a visual perspective, you can see that we're roughly in line here. Gender is fairly even. Our sample has a slightly higher incidence of boomers and Gen X and a slightly lower incidence of millennials and Gen Z. And in terms of regional representation, we're not that far off. And so the main takeaway here is that we are in line with the state for these demos. And so we can confidently break down insights based on these factors due to the size of the sample. Again, same thing holds true here with race and ethnicity and income levels. Again, we're weighting this data to bring them in line with statewide proportions, and that will allow us to segment survey responses and dive deeper into these segments based on race and ethnicity and income. We have a lot of other demographic breakdowns available to us. If you'd like to learn more about who took the survey, we have breakdowns for whether they're employed, their employment status, who they're employed with, education levels, incomes, and we'll be happy to share those in the booth backstage or down the line with you. But for now, let's focus on how we mobilize the Virginians using some of the data that we have. So how can the thoughts, feelings, and perspectives, how can we use those to build strategies to mobilize more Virginians? And when we think about that, there are really kind of 4 actions that we can take. Again, starting with the challenger community priorities we want to address. Again, that was the #1 priority for our core team. And then from there, it's really about considering the actions that will be most effective at addressing those priorities and how Virginians are already giving up their time, talent, and voices. Then we want to think about how do we identify the organizations that people trust to make a difference against community priorities and that are already mobilizing Virginians. And then finally, how do we invite and support people to give of their time, talent, and voices to address the issues they're most passionate about. So what are the top community priorities that we identified? We asked all respondents to think about these 10 areas and rank what they felt should be the top 3 priorities for Virginia. And we then followed that up with a prompt to think a little bit closer to home. So what should be the top 3 priorities for where you live? And what we see here is that overall, the order in which respondents rank their priorities remains the same, whether they're thinking statewide or local. Education, health and well-being, housing all rise to the top, with public safety and economic security following pretty close behind, as well as environmental concerns and civil and human rights. However, when we start to compare the rate of emphasis they place on the local level, we begin to see that they rate housing, public safety, economic security, and environmental concerns a little bit higher when they're thinking locally. And when they're thinking statewide, what should be priorities for all of the Commonwealth, that's where we start to see a little bit of an uptick in people prioritizing civil and human rights and democracy. It's worth noting here that we started with 10 overarching buckets as a way to kind of make this manageable. When we start thinking about community priorities, there are so many out there. So we started broad, and then for each of those that they chose, we then prompted them to think a little bit further, and rank more specific priorities within these bucket areas. So for health and well-being, for example, we wanted to gauge how respondents prioritize certain aspects of that, such as access to behavioral health services, nutrition security and food access, domestic violence prevention, senior care, youth programming. So when we take this data and start to socialize it further throughout the Commonwealth and with organizations and regions, we'll be able to dig very deeply into each of these priority areas. But for the purposes of this discussion, wanted to just kind of start broad and give you a 30,000 foot glance of where people's energies and passions really are, and that is education, health and well-being, and housing. So once they identified their priorities, we then asked them to rate certain actions and how much they felt that they would be effective at addressing those priorities. And so we asked them to think about community education and outreach, donations and philanthropy, political action, policy change and lawmaking, and also volunteerism and service, and to rate which ones, the top two, that they felt would be most effective at creating change and addressing the priorities that they identified. And when they did so, for all but one priority area, so all of the red here, community education and outreach, and political action, policy change, and lawmaking were seen as the first or second choice for being the most effective ways to address the community needs and priorities they identified. And so really what that leads us to ask ourselves is, if Virginians feel that community education and outreach and political actions are most effective, to what extent are they engaging in these acts? And the answer to that is really around how they responded to our civic action prompts. And the answer to how much and whether they're engaging in the political sphere and the community education and outreach sphere is a yes and a no. As you can see, and as Kathy alluded to in her opening remarks, voting and donations far outpace other civic actions we asked respondents to consider. But the next highest and beyond that, we start to see politically motivated outreach rise to the top. But the levels of engagement in these areas, again, lags pretty far behind voting, since we're looking at 34% posting content on social media related to a political or social cause versus double that for voting. And so when we start to further think about these actions in terms of the amount of time, energy, and effort, and just really putting yourself out there that it takes to do some of these things, what we see rise to the top are these low touch aspects of education and outreach versus the more high touch ones. And so, people are more apt to post or hit the share button or sign that petition that comes into their inbox than they are to stand in front of an elected body or in a public place advocating for change against a particular issue. From civic action, we really wanted to also dig into the informal and organizational acts of service that Virginians are engaging in, how they're using their time and talent to engage directly in their communities. And that's really that volunteerism and service bucket. And when we start with the informal levels of service, those acts that we do for each other and for our neighbors, sometimes daily, monthly, what we find is that roughly 7 in 10 of the respondents in this survey embrace those informal forms of helping their neighbors. And of those who do that, of those 7 in 10, 55% say they engage in that level of service, that informal volunteerism, more than once a month. When we ask them to then consider whether they have volunteered with an organization in the past year, 59% say yes right off the bat. So again, to one of the earlier points, for those of you keeping tabs on the national volunteering indicators, these numbers will likely feel very high, and they are. CEV Census Supplement, for example, lists this same indicator at 26%. Again, this was an intentional survey choice, and our distribution methods ensured that we got a more engaged sample. And because of that, frankly, we'd be probably alarmed if, based on who took the survey, this number wasn't this high. But regardless of national comparisons, some key trends here hold true both in the Commonwealth and nationally, and that is when you nudge people who say no or that they're unsure whether they spent any time volunteering with an organization, when you ask them to consider some things that fly under the radar of traditional volunteering or that they might not immediately recognize as such, 19% of the people who said no or unsure changed to a yes. And that's even more stark of a difference for respondents who identified as Black or Hispanic and Latino. They were significantly more likely than white respondents to change their answer to a yes when prompted to broaden that definition. And so, really, one of the key takeaways here is that there are a sizable portion of Virginians out there who are likely engaging in volunteerism or service without necessarily recognizing it as such, or calling it as such. When we then turn to how frequently they volunteer, we found that nearly 2/3 say they serve multiple times per month, with a good size of the proportion also saying once a month or less than once a month. And of those active volunteers, 79% have maintained or increased their level of volunteering over the past year, with 21% saying they decreased their volunteering rates. And so we'll dig into that decreased bucket in a little bit. Again, there's a lot higher than the CEVS supplement, but it gives us as the Virginia ecosystem a much clearer picture of the degree to which we're losing volunteers in Virginia than the national numbers do. And it also gives us a clearer sense of where our potentially most engaged Virginians are really doing and how often. So we've talked about how they're giving back, the ways in which they're volunteering and connecting in their communities. But where are they volunteering and why? Where are they amplifying their voices beyond volunteering and why? Those are key questions that we wanted to get at as well. And so to start to develop the answers to those, we really wanted to dig into organizational trust.
Hey, Andy, can I pause you real quick?
Sure.
We had a question about the trends of volunteer engagement and then the correlation to trends in church attendance, because religion and spirituality did have such a high impact on motivations to volunteer. And so I was wondering if there was anything in the survey that that might connect those two things.
Well, we did ask people whether or not they considered themselves spiritual, and as a follow-up, whether or not they were actively affiliated with a house of worship or church. And so we can start to look at those levels as a deeper dive into the data. Where you're going to see spirituality play a larger role here is when we get to the invitation and some of the key motivations and drivers. And so that's where we're going to see the levels to which spirituality and faith communities help to drive levels of volunteerism. And so hopefully we'll have some answers to that question a little bit further down the road here. And if not, hopefully I'll have some time for Q&As too at the end. And my colleague, Susan Baxter, will be in the booth after this presentation, and she can answer some questions as well. So hopefully we'll get at some of those faith components a little bit more here as we move forward. And if not, feel free to come into the booth backstage and ask some more questions so we can chat more. Okay. So again, we wanted to look into issues of trust here. And again, we'll start with some of those civic actions. Wanted to harken back to this slide. So if we recall, respondents feel political action, policy change, and lawmaking is a top 2 action to take to address community issues. And so if they feel that those are effective ways, why aren't people engaging in politically motivated actions beyond voting? And this was a key question we wanted to ask ourselves. And the first answer we came to are levels of trust. Fewer than 1/3 of respondents say they trust the government to do what is right, and only 5% say they trust the government fully. Some other answers here are around perceived agency. And what we mean by perceived agency here is that we asked respondents to consider how effective they felt it would be for them to present concerns or ideas to members of their government, both state and local. And what we find here is that a quarter or less feel that bringing issues before their governments are effective ways to make change happen. There are also some ways that trust manifests locally. Again, we had that 7 out of 10 respondents reporting engaging in that informal service, which signifies a high degree of trust people have in one another locally. But when we start to look at which types of organizations saw the most volunteers in the past 12 months, we can start to see how these organizations tend to have a unique local presence or reflect local character or even function as community spaces. And so when we look at youth and educational organizations, schools, food pantries, houses of worship, hospitals, neighborhood and recreational associations, those are very, very locally driven things. And it's no coincidence that a lot of those organizations are also nonprofits, educational institutions, or healthcare organizations, which receive the highest levels of trust on the part of those who took the survey. So that's kind of where people are mobilizing. That's who's mobilizing and why. Now we really want to take a look at contextualizing how we're thinking of mobilization in light of some of these findings we've shared. And that's really to move volunteerism from that fourth bucket that you saw earlier and place it right in the center of the engagement sphere. Because really, from Serve Virginia's perspective, volunteerism, none of these actions happen in a vacuum, and volunteerism, while it may not have received top 2 ratings for effectiveness, are in fact a key driver to every other action we typically associate. And so when we mobilize volunteers, we can enhance all facets of engagement. They can play a significant role in building awareness and education around certain issues. They can play significant roles in affecting policy decisions and supporting philanthropic endeavors. And so we really wanted to place volunteerism as Serve Virginia and service at the center of this sphere when we think about how we invite and support people to give of their time, talent, and voices to address issues. And so centering volunteerism here, what we really want to ask ourselves are, how do we invite more people in? Who do we target? And then how do we measure how successful we are at mobilizing them? And so when we think about tailoring the invitation and the experiences people have while they volunteer, we can start to craft some recruitment as well as program development strategies based on what we know will resonate. And what we know will resonate, and what we're going to cover here in the next couple of minutes, are what those top motivators are, what the key drivers of service and volunteerism are. Dig into a little bit more about some demographic insights we're seeing based on age and stage of life, and then dig into some very specific segment analysis of our target groups, which would be the most targeted appeals we can make. So normally in a presentation, we'd go motivations and barriers, but we're not going to do that. And the reason why stems from our driver analysis. We really want to focus here on appealing to motivations. Again, this is a strength-based perspective. We know very confidently the motivations that people have to volunteer and the benefits they get out of it. And we found that when we looked at motivations, they have the strongest influence on whether or not someone will say that they volunteered in the past 12 months. And that relationship is a lot stronger than barriers are to whether someone is more likely to say that they didn't volunteer in the past 12 months. Again, if you want to get a little wonky and talk data analytics, we'll have some folks in the booth, and I'll be joining there as well later. But really, what's the key takeaway here is that in terms of what drives volunteerism the most, it's really the benefits and the motivations they have to continue coming back to volunteerism. Why someone started is also strong, but it's not as strong as why they continue and the benefits, both emotional and rational, that they get out of it. And so really want to dig into some of those continuing motivations, what keeps them coming back, because that is a bigger driver than why they started. And even within some of these reasons why, we can see that some have a stronger relationship to whether someone is likely to have volunteered in the past 12 months than others. Right at the top here, feeling fulfilled and appreciated when helping others. is number one. That's number one across the board, regardless of segment analysis or driver analysis, as is feeling like you have gained or contributed your experiences and skills to help others. Another top reason why that drives volunteerism is seeing volunteerism as a way to stay active, have fun, and even make friends while doing good. The social aspect of volunteering is perhaps one that we don't tout enough or talk about enough, but it is a social act and it is a connective act. And volunteers in Virginia really recognize that and appreciate that. The next level here, we see the moderately strong strength of relationship is really about acting upon those deep-seated beliefs. Some people just, you feel that urge. It's your duty. I got to do more than donate money or goods. I got to do more than sign a petition. And so those who are driven by that deep-seated belief tend to volunteer more frequently. And those who have the personal experience of struggle in their lives, of knowing what it's like to need help, also exhibit strong indicators of likelihood of having volunteered. Going down the line here, gaining new experiences and relationships and making a difference against an important issue are also very key drivers. And here we see those who continue to give back because it's an important part of their house of worship or spirituality is also a very strong connection to whether or not someone is likely to have volunteered in the past 12 months. Now, I said we weren't going to focus on barriers, but there is one barrier worth considering that kind of frames up some of the things that we're going to continue talking about, and that is when we looked at driver analysis for barriers, while the strength of the relationship was weak across the board, the one with the strongest relationship to whether someone was more likely to say they didn't volunteer in the past 12 months is having never been invited, encouraged to volunteer, and not knowing where to start. And so when we think about extending that invitation, that is a key first step, is making sure that people are invited to join. And that is part of the resources that Kathy mentioned as well, is just extending that invitation to as many people as possible. Other barriers where their motivations can also play a role, again, time and convenience barriers, they rise to the top. And when we look a little bit further down the line here in these highlighted red areas, we start to see that they kind of fall into these buckets of lack of inspiration or lack of confidence. If I feel I serve others enough through my work in my profession, it's hard to get inspired. If I'm feeling burnt out and that the issues are just too big, or that I haven't found a cause I care enough about, again, lack of inspiration. And then if I don't feel comfortable or prepared or qualified to really help others directly, then it might be hard for me, because of that lack of confidence, to really pursue opportunities that I might actually benefit from. And so where appropriate, when we are extending our invitations to serve, we can give voice to some of these barriers and allay some of those concerns by how we extend the invitation. So those key drivers can give us insights into the overall motivations. When we think about where people are in their stages of life, however, we can start to apply another lens, and that's where demographic insights start to come into play here. And so, for example, when we look at respondents who fell into the baby boomer or silent generation categories, so those born before 1964, they are more likely to view volunteering as a chance to contribute their skills and experiences and to stay active. They're also more likely to consider service part of their spirituality and a good way to gain fulfillment beyond donating. When we flip over to our younger cohorts, our Gen Z and millennials, we see a fairly different story. They are more likely to value the experiences they gain through volunteering, whether that's exposure to new people, new career networks, new career paths, and they're also more likely to say that they're motivated by their personal experiences and employer incentives. It's important to note here as well that when it comes to the top ranked for Gen Z and millennials, fulfillment and appreciation is still the top. That is across the board. What keeps people coming back is when they feel fulfilled and appreciated in the work they provide for others. But when we start to look further down the line here about some of these generational differences, that experience and more rational benefits are what appeal to our younger cohorts. And then finally, we have our Gen X, our classic middle child, who often straddles the line, and they're most motivated by the pressing issues that we face. They also share older generations' motivations to contribute their skills and feel compelled by their spirituality. Meanwhile, they also share younger cohorts' desires to pay it forward, whereas they're less likely to view volunteerism as a career or networking opportunity. Again, probably in line with common sense, what we would think, but then to see these differences spelled out really helps us tailor our ask and our invitation in ways that get at the specific things that certain generations, depending on where they are in their stage of life, will find most appealing about volunteerism. When we think about extending the invitation, we often think about who's extending it. It's mostly nonprofits, government agencies that we think are doing the inviting. And what our ecosystem and our core team really wanted to dig into a little bit more was how respondents felt their employers should be embracing community engagement as well. And when we asked respondents to rate some certain community engagement activities and how important it was for them, for their companies or employers to do, we see here that a high percentage feel a lot of things are important. 80% really want their employers to communicate directly with them to learn about the issues that are important to them. They also want to communicate, receive regular communications about opportunities to serve in their communities. These next three here, the 79, 78, and 74, are really kind of the put your money where your mouth is type of expectations, where a certain amount of paid time off for volunteering for community service, contributing profits or pro bono services to community causes or organizations, and matching employee contributions all rate highly in importance. And then finally here, the last two, and even though they're last on the list, there's still more than 2/3 of respondents say it's important or very important for employers to do these things. And that is sponsoring group volunteer activities, such as MLK and 9/11 Day of Service events, as well as adopting formal policies that place clear value and emphasis on a person's volunteer service experiences when hiring or promoting. So we asked them what was important to them. We then followed that up by asking them how their current employers or their recent past employers, if they were retired, how well they thought employers in Virginia were doing at some of these things. And when we look at that, we see that performance measures across the board are well short of the expectations that people have in terms of employer engagement. More than 50%, however, do feel that their employers are communicating with them regularly in an effective manner, and that they are contributing profits or pro bono services to community causes and expectations. But again, there's a lot of room to grow here on the part of the role employers play in fostering that community engagement muscle. Okay, so when we think about who we're targeting, we had 6,000 Virginians responding to this survey, as we've said. So how do we start to categorize and target them? Yes, we want to appeal to everybody, but there are certain segments that we want to appeal to in certain ways. And so that's where we can start to build some of these buckets of respondents that Kathy alluded to in her opening remarks. And what we have are how we did so was really by looking at reported engagement levels. So active and frequent engagers are those who report volunteering more than a few times a week and engaged in 5 or more civic actions. Are active but sporadic are those who have volunteered in the past 12 months but decreased their level of volunteering. And then we have our potential engagers who did not report volunteering with an organization in the past 12 months. And you can see these numbers, the percentage survey population, they don't add up to 100 because they're not necessarily exclusive of one another. And so I just want to call that out in case anybody's doing math at home. So we see here some goals listed, and while they are goals, they're really kind of guiding strategies for how to think about these groups. So for active and frequent, we really want to be mindful not to overburden them, and have them volunteering every day instead of a few times a week. What we really want them doing is using their active presence in the ecosystem in new ways, to be ambassadors, to spread awareness about community issues and priorities, or some of the things in this study, perhaps, with people in their organizations. We also want them extending the invitation to serve in more concrete ways to coworkers, neighbors, family members. Again, it's not about saying, "Hey, can you already do a lot? Can you do a little more?" It's, you already do so much. How can we help you get more people to come into the tent here? For active and sporadic, we really want to better understand what has diminished their enthusiasm. Are they burnt out? Are they just getting older and aging out? Health concerns, especially in post-COVID volunteering landscape. Are they not finding opportunities related to what their highest community priorities are? It's likely some combination of these things, and better understanding them will help us reignite that passion. And then finally, our potential engagers, we want to better understand them too, of course, but we also want them to better understand that the things they do every day for their neighbors and their communities, that those things matter, and that there are ways to extend that act into other areas of their lives and communities that will benefit both. Again, this isn't a group that didn't say they didn't help out their neighbors. This is just a group that said they hadn't formally volunteered. And so they are engaging. It's just, how do we better capture their engagement, and play back to them the successes of that engagement? So I see where I don't have too much time left, so I want to hurry. I'm sorry I'm speaking very quickly, but so much exciting data to share with you that I wanted to get through as much of it as we could. And so let's look at some insights specific to each of these target areas through our segment analysis. First, and this likely comes as little surprise, those who are most active and frequent are much more likely to have higher incomes and advanced degrees. They're more likely to believe in the efficacy of bringing issues before local government officials. And they're also more likely to embrace civil discourse by interacting with people with differing views, and to feel that the media has a role to play in adding to that discourse as a watchdog and criticizing government agencies. Meanwhile, apart from income and education, our potential engagers here are much less likely to be affiliated with a house of worship, much less likely to believe that bringing issues to the attention of state and local government officials is an effective use of their time. And again, much less likely to earn over 100K or have an advanced degree. You'll see here that for our active and sporadic crowd, there are some slight differences here, but no real clues emerge when we look at these demographic segments. When we look at trust levels across these three target groups, we see that across the board, pretty much across the board, it's higher for active and frequent engagers than it is for potential engagers. That stands to reason. However, the biggest variability in their deviation is right here at the top for trust and nonprofit organizations, where here we have 3/4 of our active and frequent engagers having trust in nonprofits, while only 52% of potential engagers are saying that they trust nonprofits to do what is right. And so if nonprofits are one of our primary mechanisms through which we mobilize volunteers, the fact that potential engagers seem more wary of their motives or actions, or aren't necessarily as trusting of nonprofits, that can help to explain why they give of their time in their neighborhoods or on social media, but maybe shy away from some of those more organizational, formal forms of volunteering. A couple of other quick factors to keep in mind for potential engagers. They are a lot less likely to feel they contribute to their community through their work. And they are about 5%, 8% less likely to consider themselves a spiritual person. Again, more research into this group can potentially lift the curtain a bit more. But if employers start to embrace some of those community engagement principles, then over time we may see this change. Where we start to see some intriguing insights for our active but sporadic group is when we look at some of these barriers. And here we find that the biggest difference for the within the total population and active but sporadic is that they're 12% more likely to say that they're burnt out and that the issues are just too big to fix. They're also more likely to say that they don't have enough free time and there aren't enough convenient ways to serve. But they are receiving the invitation. The fact that they're less likely to say that they didn't receive an invitation to serve or that they don't know where to start really reinforces some of those other trends here around lack of convenience and being burnt out. Meanwhile, potential engagers here are a lot more likely to say that they've never been invited to serve, and so really that is where extending that invitation to them really comes into play. So we're armed with a lot of potential data here, a lot of potential opportunities to dig deeper into the data in the weeks and months ahead as we craft some strategic recruitment messaging and program opportunities. But want to spend the last few minutes talking about how we measure the success of what we do with this data. And for that, we've created what we're calling the Engage score, which is a new benchmark for community engagement. And by way of introduction, I just wanted to talk quickly about what this score is and also what it isn't. So what it is, it's a composite view that we're looking at 6 key indicators of engagement that we'll get to in the next slide. And it's really a way to keep us unified. There was a lot of unification that happened within the ecosystem to pull this project off. That was a first step in coming together. And this is a way for us to stay together and continue speaking the same language and looking at the same metrics. What it isn't, a grade. There is a score, but they do not represent passing or failing marks. It's just a starting point for us to measure engagement over time and how successful we are at our strategies. And it's not limited. This is not just a benchmark for the service and volunteerism ecosystem. It's not just a benchmark for Serve Virginia. Any organization can use this score and these factors to help pinpoint strategies and measure success. And so with that in mind, we can run Engage score metrics statewide, which we'll see in a minute. We can run Engage score metrics by region. We can run them by community need or priority, how well we're mobilizing against those priorities. And we can run Engage score metrics by key demographic factors, whether it's those target segments we just covered, race, ethnicity, age, income. We'll be able to look at all of those things based on the robust sample size that we have at our disposal. So the Engage score here, these 6 inputs aren't meant to suggest that they're the only ones that matter or that they're necessarily all the biggest drivers. Rather, each of these letters and the corresponding description that you see here, these are just areas where any organization can hopefully jump in, whether you're Serve Virginia or a volunteer center, a healthcare organization. Not every org has to focus on all of these things at once, but if we all pick ones that we think we can move the needle on, we can collectively begin to see how and why we're mobilizing Virginians. And so these inputs are really around those who say they're motivated by their experience and skills, those who say they're active in a house of worship or religion, since that is one of the largest differentiators for active and frequent volunteers. Also want to look at the percentage of people who say they get into volunteering because they know what it's like to have been helped and they want to pay that forward. We also want to see the level of activity, who's engaging in 5 or more civic actions, who's being spurred to action by social issues and injustice. And then again, we want to see our self-agency levels, the effectiveness people feel bringing issues before local government see how those are increasing. And so how we calculate a score based on these is for each of those questions. We remove the don't know responses. For those rate on a scale of 1 to 5 questions, we just add up the 4s and 5s. For yes or no, we just take the yeses, and then we find the average arithmetic mean of those percentages and convert those into 1 to 5 scores. Again, as we said, using this method, each input receives equal weight. We're not valuing whether or not someone is galvanized by injustice over whether someone feels bringing issues before local government is effective. They all receive equal weight so that we have a composite, as full and composite a view of engagement in Virginia as we can. So what these scores can tell us and tell the service and volunteer ecosystem over time experience. So we're at a 1.4 here. So as we do this study in 2 years, hopefully, we'll be able to see from now until then, how well are we motivating people to contribute their skills and experiences, as we know that that's one of the top motivators. Again, how well are we incorporating faith communities and spiritual purpose into the broader ecosystem of organized service and volunteerism? We'll be able to track and measure how well people who work and volunteer in helping professions are starting to build that pay it forward pipeline. We'll be able to start to measure how passionate and persistent Virginians are when it comes to making their voices heard, how many of those civic actions beyond voting that they're participating in. We'll also be able to see how many and how aware Virginians are of the social issues and how inspiring those issues are for them to act to address them. And again, we'll want to see when it comes to especially political policy change and legislative actions, whether or not Virginians are seeing the efficacy of those actions in the actions of their local governments. And so without further ado, these are our composite scores. Again, this is not a test score. None of these represent failing or passing marks, but this is our starting point. We're at 1.2 right now. In 2 years, who knows where we'll be. But eventually down the road, if we all keep pulling in the same direction and how we're extending the invitation and how we're supporting volunteers and just everyday Virginians to engage in their communities, this can hopefully one day come to a 5. That's all I have. So thank you so much. I know I didn't leave a ton of time for Q&A, but if you want to hang out in the booth, again, my colleague Susan Baxter will be there. I will be in there later this afternoon as well. And also, if you want to learn a little bit more about how we're using some of these findings to spur messaging and recruitment, join me and Casey Hayes in a session coming up here in a few minutes. And also be sure to come in later on Wednesday and Thursday, where we'll have some panel discussions around how to turn these data and insights into some actionable areas for different sectors of the ecosystem. So, okay, I see we've got some chats here. And Annalise, perhaps you can
Thanks so much, Andy.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure how much time. I can't see my clock. Oh, okay. I've got to stop soon.
I was gonna say, so it is 11:21. So if folks need to rush off for a break, that's totally fine. Also, Susan will be in the booth. So if you can click the visit link that I have up on the screen, or if you go back to the reception area, you should see the link to go see a booth up in the top bar of your AirMeet window. We can also hang out for a little bit. I think that there was a lot in the chat about different places that I think it would be great to share this data. And so thinking about both how this applies directly to folks' work, and then also thinking about how do we see this on the micro level. Lots of folks requesting to see your PowerPoint, and so we'll make sure to upload that. And then also there are resources in the VCEI booth if folks want to head over there and kind of see what's available as well.
Yes, and Susan will have a copy of this presentation at the ready in that booth. So if there was a particular slide or data point that you wanted to dig into a little bit more, she should be able to help you do that. And again, I'll look forward to hopefully seeing some of you back in some of our panel discussions where we'll unpack this a little further. But thanks so much, Annalise, and everyone for the opportunity to share this with you today.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone. See you around.